When I was a kid, and it's probably no secret to most of you, I grew up on a farm, and I've often told different people who are willing to listen to me long enough that I feel like I'm kind of the last of a particular generation. You see, growing up on the farm, we had daily chores that we had to do, and I have to say it wasn't, in all seasons at all times. But there were certain times, it seems like always I had chores to do in the morning before school and chores to do after school, unless I was in a sport, at which time my dad made some sacrifices to see that I could stay for practices and do that sort of thing. So I milked cows. I milked the cow before school. I milked the cow before church on Sunday, get up and go do that. Or I would put hay down for the beef cattle we were raising, or we'd feed chickens. And when I say feeding chickens, don't think of strewing, feed to about 20 chickens out. We were a chicken farm, so we had thousands of chickens. And so when we had them in and they were new, we fed them in flats, and you're carrying these, 5-gallon buckets full of feed and throwing it out there and then going back and getting more, or taking a big wheelbarrow of feed and walking and feeding them all. And so it was quite the process. But I don't say all that so you'll feel sorry for me because I was so abused as a child, but rather that it was just part of what we did growing up on the farm. It was part of being a part of that. And one of the things we had, as well as the daily chores, is we also had a weekly chores. And so my weekly chore as I was growing up was mowing the lawn, and my mom had a pretty extensive yard in front to mow. And so that was my job. Every Saturday, usually every Saturday, I was supposed to mow the lawn. My older sister, Jenny, she was 1 year older than me. She and I always think of us as being, and Robin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but she and I were kind of the atypical, or the typical, I should say it that way, the typical first daughter, first son. Jenny tended to do all things home ec, and so she could cook, she could sew. Mom and dad had her, cleaning, or mom had her cleaning rooms in the house. I was the one who went out with dad, doing chores, working in the barns, doing that sort of thing. And so we were kind of typical in that way. Well, on one particular Saturday, and again, back in the day, my folks would go to town, and they'd have kind of a monthly, it seemed like to me, time of going to buy groceries. And so they would go town and buy groceries, and then they would have to last through the month before the next time they went. And sometimes, things we'd start running out of a few things. That's where we invented ketchup sandwiches, where we just pour ketchup on bread, fold it over, and eat it. Actually, it wasn't that bad. It was really pretty good. But, when you run out of stuff, So one Saturday, they were going to go, and for some reason, I don't know what it was, they were leaving earlier than usual in the morning. And my mom told me that I had to stay home because I had to mow the lawn. And I began to go into my whine mode and said, because going to town was a big deal. I wanted to go. I didn't want to be left there to have to work. Everybody else is going to go into town and party. I just knew it. I knew they were going to go and do something fun. And so I started just going, and my sister, she put in her 2 cents worth as well. And so but my mom said, no, you got to stay here. You got to do your chores. We'll be back in the afternoon. So, you do your thing here, eat lunch, and then we'll be back. And we were old enough that they could leave us on our own. And so, they left, and we were both in a rotten mood. We were grumbling and everything. And wouldn't you know it, I'm in the middle of mowing the lawn, and suddenly nature calls. I had to use the bathroom, and I went into the house, and what do you think? The only bathroom we have, my sister's cleaning it. And so thus ensued, because I asked her to leave and she wouldn't, thus ensued the biggest fight that we'd had. In fact, it was the last physical fight we ever had at that point, when we finally decided that mutual destruction was a deterrent to us getting physical. We were almost the same size at that point when we were young. And so, but it was terrible. I mean, we had this big fight. I won't go into the details or the ending of it. Other than I realized after my mom got home, it was her fault. She left us there alone. If she would have said yes instead of no, none of that would have happened. I wouldn't have this scarred memory of fighting with my sister that one time. We fought other times too, but not like that. I wouldn't have, if she would have just said yes. So it was her fault. So I just say that, moms, happy Mother's Day, but yeah, thank you. Well, today is Mother's Day, and I bring that up because I was kind of wondering what kind of a message could I bring, and I want to do something that would celebrate moms and yet be a challenge, and maybe this falls more on the side of challenge than it does on celebration, although you could celebrate if you feel like, oh yeah, this is reinforcing where I am right now. And by the way, I'm not just preaching to moms this morning, because everything I'm going to say today as it applies to moms can apply to dads as well, and also can apply to the rest of us. And as kids with your parents, I hope that you at least maybe can come out of this today with a little bit more appreciation for the fact that your mom and dad have a tough job. And that your moms, when they come to you and they don't give you the answer that you want, that you need to understand that yes, they do have their reasons. You might not agree with them. How many times have we had that conversation with our kids? But they're in charge. God placed them in your life to be the ones who help you successfully get to adulthood without dying. All right? So kids, cut them some slack here. So I wanted to do all this, and as I thought about it, I decided to do it around two small but very powerful words. Yes and no. Important words. And so I'm going to build this around these words. They're words that can be abused, or they're words that can mean salvation. And so I want us to think back. The Apostle Paul was writing to a young Titus regarding Titus' ministry on the Mediterranean island of Crete. He was trying to put the church in order there. And in the midst of his letter, Paul writes the following in the second chapter, verses 11 through 14. This is what he writes. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. How many people? All people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age, while we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good. I just realized what a long run-on sentence that was that Paul put together there. But there's a lot of powerful things in that. I could preach probably 3 or 4 sermons out of this passage. I'm not going to today, so don't get in a panic. But there are some things that I want to use this as a launching spot for us as we think about these words, yes and no. And in these few verses, we see these words used, or at least we see the implication of what they mean. In verse 11, Paul begins with God giving us a great big yes. Okay? Yes, salvation is now available for all people through God's grace. Anyone, doesn't matter what you've done, doesn't matter how bad a person you think you are, anyone can come to God and say, I want to be saved. I want the life that you give. And he, 100% of the time, every single time, will always say, yes. 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 There is no one he turns away. But Paul says there's also a no. We say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, he says. We no longer live our lives as we once did according to the world's standards, and the world's standard is pretty much anything goes. Now, you can do whatever you want. I heard on the radio the other day, someone was talking about this idea of doing what you want, and their standard was, well, people can do whatever they want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. That is one of the biggest lies that Satan has ever turned out. We do not live lives all by ourselves. We are part of this giant mobile, if you can picture that, hanging in the world. And whatever we do and whatever we tug, it affects all the rest of it. Certainly the people who are closest to us. And so we need to understand that everything we do is affected in that way. And so we say no to those things that God says are harmful to us. We allow him to set the standard. We say yes to upright, godly living. We live lives that are centered around God and his will and his way. We have been redeemed, and redeemed means we've been bought at a price, bought back. We are now a people belonging to God once again. And he's done this through Jesus. And so we are eager, and again, it comes back to this whole thing of gratitude ethics, that I'm thankful. And so we're eager to do what God says because we understand what it cost him to buy us back. No one should be able to look at the cross and picture the broken Son of God dying there and not have some kind of response. No one should look at that, and if you think the thought, and you should, that should have been me. I should have been hanging there. No one can think that thought and not have some kind of response and say, if he did that for me, then I'm going to give him everything. I want to live for him. That should be our response. And so now we are people who belong to God, and we are eager to say yes to the good that we ought to do and to go ahead and do it. We have this relationship with God then. In fact, Scripture refers to God as our Heavenly Father. Remember, Jesus taught his disciples to pray, his disciples, and that includes us, by the way. We're his followers, his disciples. He taught them to pray, and what were the first words he said to start with? Our Father who what? Yeah, our Father who is in heaven. You guys all drop into Middle English pretty well. Our Father who art in heaven, okay, his name is not Art. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and it goes on from there. But he's our Heavenly Father. That's the relationship we have. And it's not just, I get the whole patriarchal culture and that sort of thing, but the reality is that when God created men and women, he created them together in his image. Male and female, he created them in his image. Okay? And so God himself, as our heavenly parent, if you will, encompasses those very traits that we sometimes associate one direction or the other in terms of fathers and or mothers. And we see it throughout Scripture as God is described. In fact, I was thinking of this week, and the passage that came to my mind was Jesus as he was coming to Jerusalem, not the triumphal entry, but as he's coming to Jerusalem, and he says in Luke 13:34, it's recorded these words, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Think of that imagery. He didn't say, how long I wanted to chase you to where you needed to be as a rooster, does. He's talking about a hen, a mother that gathers in her wandering chicks to protect them, to care for them, to nurture them. It's what God has wanted to do. It's Jesus speaking in his role as God in the flesh. And so God, our Heavenly Father, God, our Heavenly Parent, he sometimes says yes to us. And sometimes he says no, but always his goal is to grow us into the people he created us to be the best that we can be in him. And so I'm going to frame a couple of thoughts today within the context of parenting, but not just that. It's really within the context of relationships. So even if you don't have any kids, you still have relationships you are a part of. So place this within your context as we talk about some of these things, because you'll find that the truths still apply. But because it's Mother's Day, we're gonna bring it around to moms and talk a little bit about that and revolve it around these two words, yes and no. And I'm going to do that with some questions. So the first question is this: are you a yes person or a no person? Think about your personality. Think about your conversations. Think about your interactions and relationships with others, and ask yourself, am I a yes person or a no person? You know, as I thought about this, I realized that a lot of people in the world think that Christians are all no people. Did you know that? They think we're no people, and they think that our lives, or what we're trying to sell, if you would, is this idea of Christianity is all about a bunch of rules. And rules are all about no. And so, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. And no. And they think that we're just these people who are a bunch of killjoys who are just trying to keep anyone from having any of the fun that the world offers. And that's the way they look at it. They don't understand that is not true at all. In fact, I hope that as you have listened to me long enough in preaching, you're going to hear me say, hopefully quite often, that we are not saved by keeping a bunch of rules. We don't enter into that relationship with God by keeping a bunch of rules. We're saved by grace through faith. And then when we've come to that point where we fall on our knees before Him, God says, now let me transform you. I love you so much, I'll take you right where you are, but I'm not going to leave you there. And by His Spirit, then we can change and we can become different. We can become the best, what He has called us to be. So as we think about our lives within the context of being a parent or an adult in a world where there are children, we have to ask ourselves, am I a yes person or a no person? Psychologists tell us that people tend to be oriented in one direction or another, either toward yes or toward no. And so because I am willing to spare no expense in terms of the technology that we use to help us better understand ourselves, I've purchased some items to help you evaluate yourselves and test a little bit which it is that you are. So I've got these very effective pieces there. I hope you can see them. They say yes, and they say no. And as we do this we'll just do it in mass. I can't do it individually with each of you. So have this thing on? There we go. So first of all, raise your hand if this sounds like you, and I'll use a couple of samples so that you can tell, because maybe not the first one might not sound like you. Raise your hand if this is you all the time.
No. 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 N-O. No. No, 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 no. 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 No.
Okay, anybody? Oh yeah, we got a couple. All right, okay. The others are chicken. All right, let's try the other side of the spectrum here. Here we go. Is this you? Raise your hand.
Yes. Well, yes. Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Yes. Yeah, baby.
I like that one. Yeah, I saw a hand back there. Yeah. Yes, baby.
Well, yes. Yes. Give me a Y. Give me an E. Give me an F. Yes.
There we go. Yeah, that last one was pretty good as well. Okay, so as we think about this, there is this continuum, and we can fall to one side or the other. And I think there's a sweet spot in the middle that we need to find in terms of a balance between the two. I kind of liken it in some ways to coaching. Some years ago when Dana Altman first came to the Ducks, and I think Altman's a pretty decent coach, but one of the things I noticed about him, I went to the first game, one of the early games, it wasn't his first game, that he coached, and first time I had seen him, and the team was playing terrible. Right off the start, they got down by 20 just within the first 5 minutes, it seemed like, and he called a timeout, and they came over, and he just cut loose. I mean, he was screaming out. You could see the spit flying out of his mouth, and he's just, and they got their hangdog, they're down there, and he gets in there, hey, get out there and play basketball. He's just screaming out, and they go back out, and they were on fire. They became possessed. They started going, and by halftime, they caught up, and they were within a point. And just before halftime, he called another timeout, and they all came over, and I was expecting he'd be this calm coach standing there saying, okay, it's about time. But he was going nuts. Yeah, he's jumping up and down. He's slapping guys on the back. That's the way you play basketball. That's what you need to do. And I thought, okay, this guy's going to be all right. There's a balance here between praise and criticism. that he was showing and that we could see in that moment. And I think the same is true when it comes to the yeses and nos in our lives. That we can be people who will tend to one side or the other. Are you the no, 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 no? Or are you the yes, baby? Which end are you going to go to? I think you need to find a place in the middle, and you need to see, if I'm here, I need to drag myself this direction, which then brings us into a second question that we need to ask, and that's this. As a parent or mentoring adult, again, just because you don't have kids doesn't mean you don't have impact on kids, all right? Do you look for opportunities to say yes? Or is your knee-jerk reaction to always say no? Yeah. And if your kids are sitting here with you, kids, hold your comments for your parents till after the service, okay? We don't want them to writhe too much in the midst of all these things. I read an article recently written by a gal named Sherry Gordon. I don't know if she's a Christian or not. She's a life coach. She's written some kids' books. She's involved with some different groups who work on issues revolving around kids. But she wrote this article, and she was speaking to this phenomenon of what she's called yes parenting. Okay, we've heard of helicopter parenting. That's where you're over your kids to watch for problems and then solve them for them. Not good, I just say. And then there's lawnmower parenting, where you get out in front of your kid and you just mow over anything that's in their way so that they have an easy way to go. All right, if you haven't heard of that, it's a thing. Well, now the next thing she was saying that's come on the scene is yes parenting. And she explains a little bit about this. And by the way, I'll just say up front, I'm not advocating for this, and neither is she, so we'll get to that. But this is what she writes. She says, these parents go to great lengths to listen to what their kids want and then make it happen for them. So if their child wants to jump on the couch, the answer is yes. If their child doesn't want to go to school, the answer is yes. If their child wants to stay up late playing Xbox, the answer is yes. If their child wants to shred their comforter to see what's inside, the answer is yes. Basically, yes parents attempt to say yes to all of their kids' requests. No request is too crazy or too out of line. And even when these parents need to say no in order to establish boundaries or to keep their kids safe, they find another way of rephrasing the statement or redirecting their kids in order to avoid saying the word no. Overall, the goal with yes parenting is for parents to do everything they can to ensure that their kids learn that they are capable human beings, that they don't want their kids to be afraid of trying new things, that making mistakes is a normal and healthy part of life. They want them to explore the world around them in an unrestricted way, is what they say. Now, I don't know about you, but I read through the first part of that, and as I was going along, this big frown, my eyebrows started to really come down. And I was like, wait a minute. In fact, later in the article, she told about a parent who their kid started writing on the walls, and they just let him write on all the walls. I wrote on the walls when I was a kid. I couldn't sit down for a week when my mom found out. And so she goes on, and again, I'd say Sherry wasn't an advocate of this. She's just reporting on this, and she goes on to say that those who embrace that, that there are some real dangers that are here, that there's even some harm that can be done to the proper development of our children mentally, emotionally, and relationally. And I'm like, well, duh. Why can't you figure that out? Who decided on this thing called yes parenting? And then I realized it was probably people who had experienced so much no in their life that it was just refreshing to hear a yes, or so much no from their own parents or they'd observed that they decided, I'm not going to be like that. And I understand and I get that. The reality is that sometimes we can be a real no, and we need to look for opportunities in our lives to say yes. Twyla and I have talked about this quite a bit throughout the years of raising our kids, and now our grandkids are coming along. It's almost like you're kind of starting all over with the yes-no thing in some ways. But as we went along, we realized that we took a personality sorter once, and it said that they used different terms, but they said that Twyla and I happened to be pretty strong barbarians. And Some use the lion, a golden retriever and whatever, different things. Now, this one used prophets, barbarians, administrators, and it had a couple others down the line. I'm kind of a little more prophet-barbarian mix. She's pretty heavy barbarian. And she is. Our kids can tell you. What it means is that, and basically this is what it means. The prophets are the ones who basically come up with an idea and they say, and they can see no reason why it shouldn't work. Prophets say, oh, we're going to go do this, and it's going to be great, and we're going to, and it's not that Twyla comes up with ideas all the time that she thinks are going to be great, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but usually they do. But the barbarian is the one who takes the idea the prophet has and shreds it. And basically says, no, that's not going to work because of this, this, and this. Here, let's build this, and we'll make this work instead. Okay? That's what barbarians do. It's a really handy thing to have in certain kinds of roles, especially in her role with us, because she keeps us on the straight and narrow in terms of ideas that we have. But with kids, it can be kind of rough. And so we've talked through the years because her knee-jerk reaction. So one of our kids might come and say, hey, I want to do this. And she's going to say, no, that's not going to work. No, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that. Oh, this, and this, and this is wrong with that. You don't do that. And then and here again, here's another little parenting tip. Do not discuss your parenting in front of your kids. So we would get off to the side and we would talk, and I would say, honey, I said, you can't come on that strong. She goes, yeah, but what are they thinking? They can't do that. I said, I know, but no, but I said, I get it. You're right. But sometimes you got to say, well, that's an interesting idea. Let's think about that a little bit. Don't just knock them out of the tree right from the get-go. And sometimes there are situations where you can stop and say, water's going to find its own level. That if it's not going to harm them or whatever, maybe it's a learning experience to some degree. And so, maybe there's a way that we can find and look for opportunities to say yes. And I think about that. God has done that with us, has he not? I think of Adam and Eve in the garden, and think of the big yes he said to them in the Garden of Eden. You can eat from how many trees in the garden? All of them. Any tree in the garden, he says, except for one. The no seems like such a small no when you really look at it. All this yes, giving them opportunities. Here, God says yes, but then he says no to this. And even in the midst of that, he doesn't remove, why didn't he put a barbed wire fence around that tree? Why weren't there cameras? A sign, something, but instead there was a snake. But at any rate, and he still allowed us the choice. He still allowed Adam and Eve the choice, and they chose to violate his command. And then God was left with cleaning up the mess. And look what it cost him to do that. And yet what he desired coming out the other side was so important. And so, again, I'm not advocating for, okay, so once in a while I have to say yes to something. If they want to go skateboarding in the middle of the highway, I guess I look for an opportunity to say yes. No. If it's going to be harmful to them, dangerous to them, even detrimental to them, then that's not the opportunity to say yes. Okay? On the other hand, just a lot of times we don't say yes just because it's inconvenient, because it's going to be work for us. Okay? And so we get caught in those sorts of things. But we need to be ready to do that work and to understand that God works with us in the middle of that. And so we need to see how we can find those opportunities and not just rely on a default setting of saying no every time that something comes up. And realize there may be a price to pay, there may be a mess to clean up, but that's okay. Third question then that we deal with. Are you strong enough to say no? There's looking for opportunities to say yes, but for some of us, we struggle with saying no. We just find that we don't, maybe you're a person who just doesn't like conflict. And by the way, again, this doesn't just apply to parent-kid relationships, even within marriages. I've counseled people in marriages before who just hate conflict. And so they swallow their disagreement, and they always say yes because they think that's what's going to create peace and happiness in their marriage. And what they find instead is they do not wind up with a happy marriage. Conflict is a natural part of being married. You got two people, they're not exactly alike. They don't think the same way. There's no way they're going to agree on everything. It's how you resolve the conflict that's important. And the same is true with kids. And so as we find ourselves in the midst of these children, we're going to find that conflict is going to come. If you don't want conflict, don't have kids. Okay, that's just a rule. Because the truth is that they're going to challenge you on all kinds of things. And the question, we've all been to the grocery store behind that family. And the kids come up there, and the one little boy starts pulling the candy bars, because they put them down there, right by the clerk, when you're checking out. They put them all low where the kids can see them, and get them. And he's loading the candy bars into the cart, and his mom turns around and sees it, and she goes, what are you doing? Oh, it's the candy. That's how kids talk. And that's what it sounds like to us as parents, okay? It doesn't matter how old they are. And so she starts saying, you can't have all that candy. And he goes, I want some, And then finally she says, okay, you can have two. And he's like, works every time. Yeah. Or you finally have the mom who's willing to say, absolutely not. No, you put all that back on there. And the kid hits the deck. Ah, they're going nuts. And all of a sudden she's looking around like, oh no, everybody's watching me. The kid knows he's embarrassing you. Why is it that our kids always act like little gems most of the time until we get in a public situation and they go nuts? Because they know. Are we strong enough to say no? I have to say, when I was a little kid, I remember the first time my dad let me sit with my cousin by myself in the church service. We didn't have children's church, okay? Those kids don't know how lucky they have it. You do, because you have to stay in here with me. But I was bored out of my gourd. And so my cousin and I were sitting next to you. I don't remember exactly how old we were. We were pretty young. I don't know why my dad gave in. Maybe he was testing the waters. But we were sitting about 3 rows. We were in front of all the adults. My parents always sat kind of mid to closer to the front. And so my cousin and I are sitting up there, and the preacher's preaching, and we're scrolling around. Pretty soon we're pushing each other, and we're going, doing all this stuff. And all of a sudden, this hand grabbed me. My dad had gotten up in the middle of the sermon, down the center aisle, grabbed me, lifted me bodily out of that thing, and took me out the back and spanked me on the steps of the church. And it was one of those things where, you ever have one of those cries where it's the gasping, sucking in air cry, And so I'm doing that stuff, and my dad gives me the tagline that every parent says at some point, quit that crying or I'll give you something to cry about. And I'm thinking, I've got plenty to cry about right now, man. That really hurt. But at any rate, he finally lets me settle down, and he marches me back in, and he slides me in next to my mom, and I sat there the rest of the service. But what I remember is coming in that door, and all these adults, the preacher, I don't know what he was thinking, because he didn't miss a beat. He just kept going. But all these adults are turning and they're looking at my dad, and they got these big old smiles on them, and I thought they were evil. Seriously. But I know now what they're saying is, good for you, Clarence. Way to take care of that kid. You're not rolling over for him, because he was distracting everybody up there. And so we form these ideas in our minds, but I tell you, I applaud when I see a parent who says no and takes a stand and doesn't let their kid become the center of attention because they're messing around. Take them out, do what you got to do. I've taken all my kids out of places. I've taken people's kids who aren't my kids out of places. You can ask them about it if you want to know. But hey, sometimes you have to be strong enough. And And again, with our kids, they'll challenge us. They will in the midst of it. As they get older, it becomes more of a thing. Our kids, all three of them, at some point, one of them was better than the others. I won't tell you who. At lawyering up and arguing with us when we'd say no. I'd say no. Well, why? It's always why. Never once did I say, okay. Now, that never happens. Why? Well, because of this, and this. And then, they reach a certain point where they start saying, well, I'll do this so that won't happen, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen, and I would never think of that, and we'll go over here instead of this. And they start trying to lawyer their way through why they can knock down all of the things that you said. And then I say, no, it's still no. Well, why? I said, I just told you why. Yeah, but those aren't good reasons. I say, I didn't say they were good reasons. I just said no, so that's the way it is. And it usually comes down because I'm the dad and I say so, which they really hate, And at one point or another, I didn't say it often, but with my boys, at some point, I had something of a conversation around, you know what? I'm your dad, not your friend. And you might think that's horrible because a lot of parents want to be their kids' friends. I mean, that's their sole goal, is to be their kids' friends. They don't realize that when kids are little, they do not understand the sacrifice that friendship requires, the respect that friendship requires, all the things that go with it. We have to teach them that. And so I would say, I'm your dad, not your friend, but I'll tell you what, I'll be here when all your friends are gone. And so we have to, and in different ways, I say, I'm in charge of you. God has given you to me. I love you, and that's why I'm saying no. And the worst ones are sometimes when I say, yeah, okay, I understand all your reasoning, but it just doesn't feel right. Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. It just doesn't feel right to me, and so the answer is still no. Are we strong enough to say no in those situations? Because it's important. We think about, sometimes we think that the most loving thing we can say is a yes. Well, I love them. That's why I say yes. I love, sometimes the most powerful, loving thing you can say is no. Even when they don't understand it. Doesn't God do that with us? Yes, he does. There's times when I've been on my knees with God and I knew for sure that this is the thing that should happen. Felt it very strongly. Even railed at God because I wasn't getting the answer right away or at all. And sometimes in my life he said yes, but a lot of times he said, no, you have to wait. Or sometimes he said, no, it's not going to happen. And I have to get to a point where I understand and accept the fact that he loves me, and he will use whatever it is, not just for my good, but for the good of those around me. And so I need to understand that. And as parents, as we are in that role with our kids, we also need to understand that and be strong enough to say no. It comes back to, we're raising these children who start as the most selfish creatures on the planet. They're created that way to survive, okay? And so Isaiah, my latest grandchild, is just born, and I know for a fact right now that he's the ruler of that house. There's three things that he wants. He wants to be fed, he wants to sleep, and he wants his diaper changed. And when he wants it now. And so he cries. And Brittany's not going to say to him, oh, I'm sorry, honey, but dinner is not for another 20 minutes. You're going to have to wait. No. You take care of that. But as he grows older, they're going to teach him. He's going to have to learn. Yeah, no, sorry. You don't get a snack right now because I'm making dinner. It'll be ready in a minute. You're just going to have to wait. Or, I'm sorry, honey, you've got to take your nap now. You can't wait till later because we got stuff we're doing later. You got to take it now, and that's just the way it is. So get in there and take a little snooze. Or even, you got to hold it for just a little bit till I get the car to the side of the road. Don't do it in the back seat. That sort of a thing. And so we raise these children hopefully to reach a point where they understand, so they can deal with disappointment, because life is full of disappointment. Okay? So they can moderate or even eliminate, I will say it that way, their selfishness. So that one day we produce, hopefully, this adult who is selfless, who is sacrificial, who understands delayed gratification, who's willing to go the extra mile because it's right. It's what God calls us to. So we need to be strong enough to say no. There's this continuum then between yes and no. And it's something we learn as we go, and I think it's something we continue to learn. You know, I'm in the stage where I'm doing full-on grandpa stuff now, and Twyla's grandma. And we're still learning. So now what does that mean? What does that look like? How do we do that? We're learning that in our own relationship, even though we've got a lot of that knocked down now, having been married long enough, you know, which is a good thing. Some people haven't, but we need to find that. You know, do I need to look for opportunities to say yes, or do I need to be strong enough to say no? Where do I find the balance of that? And it's going to be different for every last one of you. Because all of you are different, and all of you have kids that are different from other kids. We can't say one size fits all. Wouldn't that be nice? But it doesn't work that way. God gave you, moms, God gave you to your kids to be their mother. And that means finding that balance of yes and no. Don't be afraid to use either and to step up to that. And the same is true for the rest of us. I have in our family, there are 5 kids. It went girl, boy, girl, boy, girl. And my youngest sister, Mel, is 10 years younger than me. And I remember when she got to about 2 or 3 and her language skills were developing, we had this little game we played. I don't remember, Robin, if you remember this, but we, I don't even know how it started, but one day we were doing something, she came to me and Melody asked me to do something, and I said no. And all of a sudden she got her little defiant self on and she goes, yes. And I said, no. She goes, yes. And then it just started going faster. Yes, no, yes, no. Yeah. And she got this big old grin on her face. She said, this is a fun game. And every once in a while we would do that. And then one time we did it and we're going along, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And all of a sudden I changed and I said, yes. And she stopped. And she was shocked. She was like, what's going on? And she says, no. And she goes, you say yes, I say no. And she goes, no. And then I go, yes, and then we start all over again, and I'd flip it up. But I think even then, we were learning and testing out this whole thing that we live in a world of yeses and nos. All right? And God has given us a lot of freedom here, but as we grow and as we parent, as we marry, as we have friends, as we work in a job, as we do all of these different things, we are learning this balance between looking for opportunities to say yes and being strong enough to say no. And God can help us get there. Now, moms, I'm going to speak specifically to you right now. I recognize that just, and I'm not saying dads don't have this, but I recognize that as moms, you have little ones who come at you, or you've experienced this in the past, with questions every day, all the time. I want this. I want that. Could you do this for me? Could you do that? And you're struck with the yes, no, and it can just build this stress. All right? And so as a gift to you today, we're going to give to each of you this little sachet of lavender. Because I read that lavender, the scent of lavender, is a calming scent, and that it relieves stress. Okay? And so we wanted to give you a gift, so I'm going to give you this little gift. As on your way out, we'll try and have a couple people at each door there that has this little thing of lavender. And it's also to remind you that sometimes, rather than being knee-jerk with either answer, we need to take a step back, let the stress roll off, and say, what would be the best answer here? Okay, you don't always have that privilege. Sometimes it's in the moment. But to take and pause and say, what can I do here? Maybe there's an opportunity to say yes here. Or maybe I just need to take a stand, say no, and know it is. And that both of those things are going to teach my child something. And I'm willing to do that. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, I thank you for moms today. Thank you for my mom and what she's meant to me through the years. Father, I just pray that you would pour a special blessing on each mom who's here today as we celebrate Mother's Day today, and we do thank you for that gift. Father, I also pray for the rest of us, Lord, for kids. Lord, may we respect the authority that you have placed on our parents. May we not be a pain to them. Father, help us as even kids who follow Jesus to truly think about the things that we ask and how we treat our parents and how we might be better followers of you, even as kids. For all of us, that would be true, Lord. Help us to find our way through this life. We thank you, Lord, that you help us in the messes that we get into all the time. And we praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen.